Everybody. It's good to see you back here again for another day. I'm Stuart Smyth from the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm going to serve as moderator or chair of the panel, I guess. This is designed to be more of a roundtable, so we're not going to have formal presentations. The three panelists, Jeremy DeBeer from the University of Ottawa, Margo Bagley, University of Washington. No, I got that wrong. I'm sorry, Margo. I just blanked on you.
Emory University.
Emory, yes. And then Amber Holtzman Sharp. No.
Hartman Scholz.
Yeah, from Germany is the third panelist. We're just waiting for her to join, but I think we'll get started. She had mentioned that her children had COVID the other day, so she may have had some challenges with that. But this panel is on digital sequence information and the evolution of what's gone on. This is a rapidly evolving space in the ag and the information access and benefit sharing, traditional knowledge space. So we felt that it was important to have more of a roundtable discussion. So we're looking forward to having a very interactive. We've put together a short list of questions that the panelists will be responding to, but certainly looking for people to throw their hand up and participate as much as possible. So without any further ado, the three panelists will give sort of a 5-minute overview of specific aspects of the DSI conversation. And I'll turn it over first to Jeremy DeBeer.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Hi, Margo.
Hi, Jeremy.
Thank you for the conference organizers for the opportunity to participate in this panel. The topic of DSI, digital sequence information, was a topic that we first introduced to this conference audience 3 to 5 years ago. And a lot has changed in the last 3 to 5 years. I'm going to suggest that the DSI debate, the policy debates over digital sequence information, are the 21st century equivalent of GMO regulation. DSI and the policy and governance space around DSI has the potential to be that significant. In fact, DSI is broader than GMO regulation because it affects literally all aspects of biotechnology and the bioeconomy. Digital sequence information and the governance of digital sequence information transcends agriculture, has profound impacts in the area of health and in the area of climate and environment. It is deeply intertwined with trade law and trade regulation. There are economic implications, and there are also sociocultural and religious implications around DSI, some of which I hope we'll be able to discuss in the course of this panel. If we think just about the agriculture space for a moment, DSI is part of the digitization of agriculture more generally. We can think about data-driven agriculture and digital agriculture, smart farming, precision agriculture, terms we've all heard thrown around, in two ways. This is an oversimplification, but analytically helpful to understand the topic. We can think of upstream data-driven agriculture innovation. By upstream, I mean the sequencing of plant genomes in order to improve crops that are then used on farm. We can also think of downstream data and digital agriculture issues, where we're seeing increasingly the adoption and deployment of digital agriculture techniques involving data, meteorological data, commodity pricing data, soil microbial data, crop yield data, personal data. These are all on-farm or downstream applications of data-driven or digital agriculture. So that's where the DSI debate fits in. It's one of these upstream applications. The governance of DSI is developing in many different fora, locally, nationally and regionally, and globally. In the 2018-19 working paper that was first presented to this conference, subsequently published in 2020 by Stuart, myself, Diego McCall, and Peter Phillips, we talked about different governance fora where DSI debates are playing out. We speculated that there might be opportunities to regulate DSI in a greenfield space, in a new comprehensive overarching fora, a new multilateral treaty or agreement. More likely, we thought that we would see a combination of industry self-regulation, potentially with consumer branding and labeling, playing a role in governance, data governance best practices, and a multi-level networked form of regulation emerging from various different institutions. The Convention on Biological Diversity is where most of the concrete debate about DSI governance has been playing out so far. The discussion at the CBD is about a potentially new governance framework following on the Cartagena Protocol and the Nagoya Protocol to govern access and benefit sharing around digital sequence information. But the WHO, the World Health Organization, is also active in developing norms and practices around what in the health space is called gene sequence data, GSD. We see significant developments in the WTO, where we're talking about access to information protected by intellectual property rights. We've heard about the waiver of TRIPS intellectual property obligations in order to facilitate access to vaccines against COVID-19. The digital sequence information associated with viruses is a part of that discussion. At the World Intellectual Property Organization, another specialized agency of the United Nations, we see a committee developing norms around traditional knowledge and genetic resources of Indigenous and local communities. And there are efforts to negotiate a framework to govern data and information in that context. And we're seeing the Food and Agriculture Organization increasingly take an interest here. In fact, a paper that I've been working on with my colleagues, Dr. Chidi Ogwamanam and Dr. Eliane Ubalajoro, is going to be released by the FAO in September, looking at the implications of DSI for the FAO's multilateral benefit sharing system under the International Plant Treaty. So that gives you a broad context in which these issues are playing out. And I think Margo, and if Amber's here, will elaborate more specifically on some of the concrete issues at the CBD. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. And that was a great introduction. And now we're going to turn it over to Margo Bagley, and I will properly introduce her this time. It is Margo Bagley, who's with the Emory University School of Law in Atlanta. So Margo, over to you, please.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks, Jeremy, for that really helpful overview. And it has been, well, at least the first time that I was involved in this particular forum was in 2019 when we were talking about DSI, and Jeremy's right, a lot has happened since then. But just to give a bit of background about what's going on at the CBD, where DSI has really taken center stage as a key issue in the negotiations. The CBD, for those who may not be very aware, is the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which has as its key principles that states have sovereign control over the biological resources within their borders, but should endeavor to make access to those resources available on mutually agreed terms with prior informed consent, and that there should be the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of those genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. So the objectives are about conserving biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and fair and equitable benefit sharing. But the CBD really didn't specify how that benefit sharing was to take place, and that ultimately led, and the CBD was in 93, ultimately led in 2010 to the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing to the Convention on Biological Diversity, which set out kind of a framework for countries who so choose to require access to genetic resources, and particularly for benefit sharing. But the Nagoya Protocol really talks about or has in mind, even though DSI intangible information was discussed, it didn't make it anywhere into the text. And so the Nagoya Protocol and the CBD really facially deal with tangible genetic material. In fact, genetic resources are defined as genetic material in the Nagoya Protocol. And so that has raised questions as we've had a rise in use of sequence information, in many cases replacing the need to access tangible material. The question of whether benefits should be shared from uses of DSI, and does DSI come within the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol? Is it within scope, as it were? And this issue really made it onto the agenda in 2016 at the Conference of the Parties meeting in Cancun for the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. And coming out of that meeting, there was the commissioning of a study on the concept and scope of DSI. What are we really talking about? That Sarah Laird and Rachel Winberg wrote. And that was considered by a first ad hoc technical expert group, or ATEG, on digital sequence information that met in 2018. I was on that ATEG, a member, and we found it difficult to agree really on much of anything in relation to DSI, except really that the term DSI is not really a good one, but it's a placeholder that we'll continue to use until a better one comes along. As Jeremy noted, in other fora, different terms are used, but so far DSI is still remaining the key term that folks are referring to now. Oh, good. Amber's here. So Amber, I'm just talking about what's been going on in the CBD in relation to DSI. And as Jeremy mentioned, this issue has been discussed in a number of fora, but in the CBD, there's really been this increasing or expanding process of considering the different aspects of DSI. And after that 2018 ATEG, there was the Conference of the Parties in 2018 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So there are these CBD meetings every 2 years. And coming out of that one, where there were very important, very hard-fought discussions on DSI, there was agreement coming out of a decision 1420, to create a science and policy-based process on DSI that would be informed by studies, and 4 studies were identified to be commissioned further on the scope of DSI, how it's currently used, traceability of digital sequence information, and what's going on in databases, as well as what provider countries are actually doing. Are countries regulating DSI? And those studies were actually completed in 2020 to inform the work of a second ATAG, a second ad hoc technical expert group on digital sequence information. And I think they were pretty helpful overall in terms of how DSI is currently used. The first study really helped to identify how you could define DSI in terms of groups. Is it just DNA, RNA? Does it include metabolites, et cetera? And that was, I think, helpful for the ATAG. Amber, who just joined us, was one of the lead authors on studies 2 and 3, which were combined into one study really on traceability and focused on these publicly accessible databases where we see DSI being added on a regular basis, and the amount of information, sequence information, just really increasing. And the challenges that these databases pose for traceability if one were to try to trace the origin of sequence information to impose some sort of benefit sharing obligations. And then I was the lead author on a 4th study that looked at what countries were doing currently. We looked at all of the 196 members of the CBD and identified several, around 16, I think, that actually were regulating. DSI had put laws or regulations in place relating to DSI. Others, another 18 or so that were considering doing so, but kind of waiting to see what would happen in many cases at the international level, or lack the capacity to really do that at this time. And we also noted that there were many different approaches that these countries were taking to DSI, and that created really a web of uncertainty for users in terms of having to comply with these different approaches. The next conference of the party meeting was scheduled to take place in 2020 in Kunming, China. It was, of course, that didn't happen because of the pandemic, and the date has continually been pushed on. Now it looks like it'll be, I believe, November in Montreal, the headquarters of the Secretariat of the CBD. But a lot has happened in this extended intercessional period. Following the release of that second ATAG report, which considered the various studies, there have been activities, both formal by the CBD Secretariat, as well as by other interested parties, other reports, lots of webinars, trying to provide additional information and opportunities for parties to get together and talk through what should happen with DSI. And the Secretariat came up with a list of, I think it was like 6 different possible approaches that could be taken to DSI. And those approaches have continued to be considered in particular through an informal advisory group, looking at the challenges, the opportunities, the possible modalities of benefit sharing options for DSI, if there ultimately will even be agreement to that. So at this point, I'll turn over to Amber to talk about what's been happening in relation to the informal advisory group moving forward.
Thank you very much, Margo. So now we're welcome to join the 3rd panelist. We've got Amber Hartman Scholz, who's the scientific deputy to the director with the Leibniz Institute, Germany. And Amber, welcome to the panel, and we'll turn it over to you, please.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Jeremy. And Margo, my apologies. Man, you're getting one person who's, 3 a.m. And, when Margo wrote 3 a.m., I was thinking, no, wait, does she have her time off? Because I knew there was 6 hours. But I figured out the problem is I was in Nairobi and I got COVID. And the last time that I actually looked at my calendar was on Nairobi time, which is an hour ahead of Europe. So my deep apologies and unprofessionality. I'm actually still on sick leave, but I wanted to come to join you all. So you're my first attempt back to the real world. So forgive the COVID fog that you're living with and for the rudeness of being so late. So as Margo already laid out for you, there was like everything else in the world, but especially the international policy processes, the question on whether or not there should be benefit sharing from DSI in the context of the CBD. It got coronified, and so this process has been online for really a full 2 years. And the first in-person meeting, and I guess I should also say what happened during that coronification, although there were a number of webinars, the parties in the broader context of the CBD also explicitly said they refused patently to negotiate online. And so in the open-ended working group 3.1 meeting last August, which was supposed to take place in Colombia, that online meeting basically said, until there are in-person meetings, we're not negotiating. So everything really was on hold until what was supposed to be December, and then became January, and then became March. And so the very first time that the negotiators that are responsible for DSI saw each other since Sharm el-Sheikh in 2018 at COP14 was in March 2022 in Geneva, where the open-ended working group 3.2, they started adding these point numbers on to indicate that there was an online session, and then now this is the actual session. They did the same thing, by the way, for COP15. There's been a 15.1 online, and we're still waiting for the COP15, which we now know will be at the end of the year, at the beginning of December, will take place in Montreal under the Chinese presidency. So we're back. A decision on DSI is happening. And perhaps what's also interesting to know, you might have heard me say the words open-ended working group, and what's happening with an open-ended working group? Like, why is that something that, why is the issue of DSI, which is a technical one, part of the open-ended working group? An open-ended working group of what? Well, it's the open-ended working group of the global biodiversity framework. The way that the CBD works, it tries to set biodiversity targets, basically, or strategic plans every decade. So between 2010 to 2020, there were the IT targets in the biodiversity strategic plan, and in 2020 to 2030, and actually looking onwards to 2050, we're supposed to have a global biodiversity framework. Well, it's going to be at least 2 years late, but it's the first time that in the world of biodiversity, we will actually have quantitative indicators for biodiversity loss, and actually potentially even regional or national indicators, which so far in this global context we never had. So it's incredibly exciting from an environmental policy point of view. However, if you can think about how exciting that is, you get nothing for free in life, right? And so DSI is that not free part of that deal. And that's incredibly important perhaps for this audience to sort of think about that. Your first reaction probably as a scientist or someone close to science is to say, why would you ever mess with online open data in the context of benefit sharing? And the reality is that there's a huge amount of political pressure to get the global biodiversity framework, and DSI is really a trading, a horse trade or a trading chip here in that political process. And so the reason that DSI has been negotiated in Geneva and then again in Nairobi in these open-ended working group meetings is because it's part of this GBF. And in fact, you have regional groups, for example, Africa, literally stating on the record in the lay media, we're not going to agree to the GBF until there's a deal on DSI. So for those, I think, stakeholders that have taken the strategy to say, we think that DSI is a terrible idea, there should be no deal on this, it's actually a bit naive in the context of the larger players, in my personal opinion. So then circling back, what have been the movements or the new pieces that have emerged over the last 6 months, again, as negotiators finally start to meet in person officially, and then there have even been a number of smaller informal meetings in the months in between these meetings. And I think we see reason for hope as a scientific community, and also reason still for concern. So the document, I don't have it in front of me. I was going to do that right now if I thought the meeting was starting at 10. But there's a document that came out of Geneva and was further negotiated in Nairobi, and that is the basis for the negotiation in Montreal at the end of the year. it basically lists criteria for what a DSI solution will look like. And from the point of view of a scientist, what I'm most excited about is to see words like open access, to see the importance of DSI for research and innovation in there, and a focus and an emphasis everywhere on multilateralism, which would basically mean a push towards standardization in global terms and conditions. And I think that those are the only possible realistic ways to move forward on this issue. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about that if it comes up in the panel discussion. But my biggest point of concern, in spite of those really encouraging trends, it really means that policymakers have been listening to what scientists and what stakeholders have been saying in recent years online. The word that emerged out of Geneva that had not yet existed in international discussions is the word hybrid. So for a long time in the sort of online discussions between Sharm el Sheikh and Egypt, you can see COVID fog, and this sort of, first in-person meetings in 2022, it had basically been this decision: bilateral, meaning Nagoya-like, right, where you would have to invent some kind of a tracking and tracing of system, versus multilateral. And what emerged in multilateral, meaning you would have, kind of like the plant treaty, right? You would have a standard agreed terms and standard conditions, and then standard sort of benefit sharing rules. What emerged in Geneva is the word hybrid, and it came from the Latin American region, and it's basically goes something like bilateral when we can get it, and then multilateral if we can't. And I find that extremely discouraging, because it's kind of like the game whack-a-mole that you might play like in an arcade game, where you think you finally whack the bilateral mole and then a new mole pops up out of a new hole. And that for me is sort of this word bilateral, where, hybrid, where you finally feel like you've convinced the majority of negotiators that a very complex Nagoya-like DSI system would never work, and they come up with a new idea called hybrid. And I believe that this will really be the focus of discussions over the next 6 months, is to sort of figure out, well, what exactly are people trying to say when they say hybrid? And I can fill that in if you'd like to later. And second, for the scientific community to now really engage with policymakers and to say, this wouldn't make any sense. This actually makes it worse than just doing bilateral pure, is to have two parallel systems working, where we have to figure out which one we belong in, and all of the rules that might go along with that. And so maybe just to wrap up, and the reason that meetings like these are so important to me is I think that this is the time where each of us in the countries that we come from need to reach out to our responsible negotiators and policymakers and say, this is bad, this would never work, and this is an area of compromise that we could support as a stakeholder community. And for me, that is multilateralism, and looking for compromise solutions in the broader context of the global biodiversity framework. I hope that was helpful, Stuart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much, Amber. We certainly benefited from your participation in all of these events, and I think your comments are incredibly insightful. So the way we wanted to have this panel roll out is more of a roundtable. So we prepared a couple of questions that I'll pose to the panelists, but feel free to intervene if you've got questions of clarification or you want to ask your own question at any point. Don't feel that this is a very formal panel that you have to wait until everybody here is as exhausted what they have to say before you can jump in as a participant. So the first question I'd like to pose to the panel is, as with anything, there's going to be trade-offs. So in your own perspectives, what would you say are the sort of the couple of key benefits and key challenges to innovation from reaching a global or potentially global DSI solution? And Margo, why don't we start with your perspectives on that?
Sure. Reaching a consensus, of course, I think one of the biggest implications and benefits would be increased certainty for researchers users, providers, everyone, because it's difficult when we're kind of in this limbo period. And as I mentioned, countries are doing their own thing. There are so many different approaches, and that makes it difficult to know what you have to comply with, and what sort of sanctions you might be imposed on you. And that's just not very helpful. So if we could get to some sort of agreement, especially as Amber noted, on some kind of a multilateral solution. Bilateral is problematic for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. It just isn't going to work for the vast majority of the DSI that's out there. So yes, I would say the biggest thing is increased certainty, but it kind of depends on what the consensus is, because there could be a consensus, an agreement not to agree. And then you really haven't done anything, haven't moved anywhere. So it is possible that we could get increased certainty, but and with increased certainty, hopefully improvements for biodiversity, hopefully improvements for the stewards of biodiversity, the in many cases Indigenous peoples and local communities that are preserving biodiversity from us and stemming loss of species. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Margo. Amber, what are your thoughts around some of the, the main benefits, but also the key challenges? I think you highlighted some of those in your presentation, but to just sort of crystallize them, I think would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with Margo, and that's why her study was really important, I think, because to sort of say, look, there are already 16 countries and some really big ones too, like Brazil and partially also India, that have very significant effects on the research community, that already have national legislation making it very hard to figure out, if you do a global analysis, like how you're supposed to slice and dice what your potential legal obligations are. And that's the status quo. And so having an opportunity at the international level to clean up the unevenness that we already have, and that would certainly get worse if there's no deal. That's the other piece, is like, well, maybe there's not going to be a deal. And then what will happen is you'll have a promulgation of new legislation. For example, I recently saw a new draft DSI legislation coming out of Colombia that they're very clearly and explicitly saying, like, this is what comes if there's no CPD deal, right? So the machinations are happening, but perhaps I can offer from a technical point of view, it is right now very hard to figure out what your obligations are. You have this perverse system where if you access genetic resources under the Nagoya Protocol, or even under the International Treaty for plant genetic resources of food and agriculture, then if you sequence, some whole genome or a metagenome or many different pieces of things, of marker genes, let's say, you upload them into the sequence databases in order to publish your research, then those sequences kind of go into the world and you lose control over it. The country, of course, loses control over it. And the users that might be trying to do the very best they can with whatever rules were in place when you access the original genetic resources, if they were trying to figure it out, they have no chance. Those data fields don't exist in the databases. There are no rules. And so it is the Wild West. And the provider countries that are providing access to their genetic resources also are legitimately saying, like, that's not really fair. Like, that's not the original agreement. But yet, even if you're perfectly good intentioned and angelic scientists, you don't have a way to figure that out. And so you're kind of between a rock and a hard place in terms of really being an ethical and well-intentioned person. So that's not great. And a deal and at the international level with ideally standardized global rules would simplify that. The other thing that doesn't get a lot of attention that I'm personally advocating a lot for behind the scenes is the potential that the DSI deal could also bring in, probably on an opt-in basis, the physical genetic resources that are under the Nagoya Protocol. So imagine texts in a legal document that said the genetic resources, the physical genetic resources that are used to produce DSI, if the country of origin wishes, can also be in the multilateral system. Right now we have the Nagoya Protocol and that's it. I mean, of course, the plant people get lucky with the multilateral international system to a certain extent. And there's the PIP framework, for pandemic flu, but otherwise it's every man for himself when it comes to the Nagoya Protocol, or woman for herself. And the opportunity, if negotiated strategically, to potentially have an opt-in mechanism for physical genetic resources, and then the accompanying simplicity and standardization that we're seeking for the digital data, I think could be a huge opportunity, and that's getting really no attention. And I think that that's also for good reason in terms of the political traction or political capital that people don't want to waste too early, because it would be a really, really blow up in your face negotiation strategy to explicitly say that you were trying to undermine the Nagoya Protocol. But yet I think that there are good, compelling reasons why physical genetic resources being part of the DSI deal as an option could happen. But that's maybe still my dream and not necessarily something you see in the text yet. You see it only in one little place in the annex, and you would need to build on that before it could go all the way.
That was excellent, Amber. So as a surprise to the panelists, I came up with 2 more questions during your response. So before we get into those, I'll turn it over to Jeremy for his response.
Hi, Amber, and thanks for that. Hi, Margo. Thanks for your comments. I think that there's a sense that a resolution of the debate over access and benefit sharing around digital sequence information at the CBD could lead to a utopia where we have uninhibited open access to digital sequence information with ample benefits flowing to lower and middle income countries, scientific communities within those countries. I'm quite skeptical that that's likely to happen, in part because I think the way the question is framed in terms of benefits of a global DSI consensus, what we're really talking about here is just a sliver of the overall problem or challenges around the governance of digital sequence information. We're talking about a breakthrough in one particular organization, which is really important. It's necessary in order to, I guess, grease the wheels of negotiations in other fora. But it's important that we not lose sight of the fact that digital sequence information, gene sequence data, whatever we call it, is already owned under the rules established by the WTO through the TRIPS agreement. And there are all kinds of ways in which this information is legally and factually controlled. Trade secrets, copyright protection for selection and arrangement of information that goes into databases, patents on inventions derived from this information. And so if we're going to have a truly open system with meaningful benefit sharing, we're going to have to address the governance challenges in other fora as well. We may, through a consensus at the CBD on ABS, be able to overcome this political impasse and make progress toward other desirable outcomes, like the Global Biodiversity Framework. But unless we look at this topic in a more holistic way, I actually don't see us realizing the full range of benefits from a so-called global consensus. Maybe a more succinct way of putting that is, I'm not sure a consensus is feasible because of the proliferation of fora where these governance issues are playing out.
Thank you, Jeremy.